Hey everyone, I never thought I'd end up here spilling my guts to strangers, but I need to get this off my chest. My wife, Ava, and I have been married for 6 years. Things weren't perfect, but I always thought we were solid, at least, until the trip to the mountains. Ava suggested it, saying we needed a break from work and the city grind. Honestly, I was on board. Our relationship had felt a bit strained lately. She was distant, always on her phone, and less interested in spending time together. I blamed it on stress. We both worked demanding jobs. But this trip felt like a chance to reconnect. My best friend, Matt, and his girlfriend, Nina, were coming too. Matt and I had been tight since college, and I considered him a brother. Nina was newer to the group, but she was sweet and seemed to ground Matt in ways no one else ever had. We rented a cabin nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by towering pines and the crisp mountain air. It was picturesque, the kind of place meant for unwinding. But even from the start, something felt off. The trip started great. We unpacked, shared beers around the fireplace, and reminisced about old times. Ava seemed more relaxed than she had been in months, laughing with Nina and occasionally stealing glances at Matt. I thought nothing of it at first. They were friends, we were all friends. But then I noticed the way her laughter lingered when Matt cracked a joke. It was subtle, a fleeting smile, a spark in her eyes, but it was there. I brushed it off, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Jealousy wasn't my thing, and Matt was like a brother to me. I chalked it up to my imagination. The next day, we went hiking. It was supposed to be a group activity, but halfway up the trail, Ava and Matt fell behind. Nina and I noticed but didn't think much of it. They returned after about 20 minutes, sweaty and out of breath. We got lost for a bit, Matt explained, laughing it off. Ava didn't say much, just wiped her brow and smiled awkwardly. That night, the unease set in. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling, but when I saw Ava whispering something to Matt while Nina and I were busy prepping dinner, my stomach churned. It wasn't just the whisper. It was the way they looked at each other, like they were sharing some private joke. I stayed quiet. I didn't want to ruin the trip over something that might be in my head. But that night, as we sat around the fire roasting marshmallows, I kept catching Matt and Ava exchanging glances. Nina was oblivious, and I envied her. Later, I stepped out to grab my jacket from our room and noticed Ava's notebook lying open on the bed. She always carried it, claiming it was her escape. I know I shouldn't have, but something in me screamed to look. What I saw wasn't explicit, just vague musings about temptation and the thrill of the unknown. But her handwriting betrayed her. It was frantic, messy, not like her usual neat script. That's when the first crack appeared. I convinced myself it was nothing. It had to be. Matt was my best friend, and Ava was my wife. There was no way either of them would cross that line, right? I'll post more when I can. I didn't expect so many people to respond to my first post. A lot of you were asking for more context, like what Ava and I were like before all this and how Matt fits into our lives. Honestly, it's a bit therapeutic to lay it all out, so here goes. Ava and I met 8 years ago at a work seminar. She was presenting, and I was in the audience, completely captivated. She was this incredible mix of smart and confident but still had this down-to-earth vibe that made everyone gravitate toward her. I remember thinking if I don't ask her out, I'm going to regret it forever. Our first date was nothing fancy, a coffee shop near her office. We talked for hours, and for the first time in years, I felt like someone truly got me. We both came from modest backgrounds. Ava grew up in a small town, the youngest of 3, while I was the oldest of 4, constantly playing the role of the responsible older sibling. She loved how steady I was, and I admired her fire. For years, we were that couple everyone envied. We traveled, built a life together, and eventually bought our first home. Marriage felt like a natural step, and for the most part, it was great. Sure, we had arguments, but who doesn't? We complemented each other. I was the planner, the steady hand, while Ava brought the spontaneity and excitement. Or at least, that's what I thought. Matt came into my life way before Ava. We met during our freshman year of college when he crashed a study group I was leading. He wasn't exactly the bookish type, more the charming slacker who somehow got by with half the effort. But man, could he win people over. He had this magnetic personality that made you want to be around him. We ended up roommates sophomore year, and it felt like I'd gained a brother. He was there for all the milestones, helped me through my parents' divorce, celebrated when I got my first big promotion, and stood beside me as my best man at our wedding. When Matt met Nina 2 years ago, I was thrilled. She was different from his usual type, serious, career-focused, and honestly, way too good for him. But she seemed to balance him out, and for the first time, I saw him genuinely invested in someone else's happiness. Ava and Nina clicked instantly, and the four of us started hanging out regularly. Looking back, I guess the cracks in my relationship with Ava started showing a year ago. Life got busy. Work for both of us was demanding, and date nights turned into take-out dinners in front of the TV. I started working late, thinking I was doing the right thing by focusing on providing for our future. But Ava hated it. She never said it outright, but I could see it in the way she'd roll her eyes when I mentioned a late meeting or how she'd sigh when I brought work home. Her job, meanwhile, seemed to be giving her everything she wasn't getting from me. She got promotions, traveled to conferences, and was constantly surrounded by people who adored her. I was proud of her, but I started feeling like a background character in her life. Then there was Matt. He and Ava always got along, maybe a little too well at times. But I trusted them completely. I'd seen Matt at his worst. There was no way he'd risk our friendship like that. And Ava? She wasn't the kind of person who'd throw everything away for a fling. Or at least, that's what I believed back then. If I had to pinpoint when things really shifted, it was about 6 months ago. Ava started pulling away, not physically, but emotionally. She was always on her phone, texting someone. When I asked, she'd laugh it off, saying it was just work stuff or Nina venting about Matt. And Matt? He started showing up more often, usually unannounced. He'd bring wine or suggest impromptu dinners, and while I loved hanging out with him, I couldn't shake this feeling that something was different. Maybe I'm overanalyzing now, but even back then, I sensed it. The way Ava would light up when Matt walked into a room, how she'd laugh just a little too hard at his jokes. And then there were the silences, the moments when I'd walk into a room, and they'd suddenly stop talking. At the time, I brushed it off. I mean, who wants to think the worst about the two people they trust most? But now, looking back, I can't help but wonder if the seeds of betrayal were already planted, just waiting to bloom. I'll stop here for now. The next part will dive back into the trip itself, because, trust me, things got even weirder after that first hike. Thanks for reading, and for those of you who've been sharing your own stories, it helps more than you know. Picking up where I left off, the trip to the mountains was supposed to be a reset, a way for Ava and me to reconnect. But the more I reflect on those first couple of days, the more I realize that things were already veering into strange territory. After that hike where Matt and Ava got lost, something about the trip's energy shifted. It wasn't drastic, just small things, like how Ava seemed more engaged with Matt than she was with me. It wasn't outright flirtation, at least, not at first, but she laughed at his jokes like they were the funniest thing she'd ever heard, and their conversations had this easy flow that I hadn't shared with her in months. I tried to brush it off, even convinced myself it was good that Ava was enjoying herself. After all, I wanted her to be happy. But that nagging feeling wouldn't go away, and I found myself hyper-aware of every interaction between the two of them. On the second night, Nina and I decided to cook dinner while Matt and Ava hung out on the deck. It was nothing fancy, just burgers and grilled veggies, but I was excited. Cooking together was something Ava and I used to love, and I thought maybe this would be a chance for us to bond. Instead, she volunteered to keep Matt company while Nina and I handled the food. I didn't say anything, but as I flipped burgers, I couldn't help glancing through the window at them. They were sitting close, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the deck lights. Matt said something, and Ava threw her head back, laughing in a way that felt too familiar. Meanwhile, Nina was humming a song to herself, blissfully unaware. I don't know why I didn't say something. Maybe I was scared of sounding paranoid. Maybe I didn't want to ruin the evening. Instead, I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced a smile when Ava came back inside, her cheeks flushed from the cool mountain air. She kissed my cheek like nothing was wrong, but it felt hollow. That night, while everyone else was winding down in the living room, I decided to step outside for some air. I told them I was going to grab firewood, but really, I just needed a moment to myself. My thoughts were racing, and I couldn't shake the image of Ava and Matt laughing together on the deck. As I walked past Matt's car, something caught my eye. It was his phone, sitting on the front seat, screen still lit up. Normally, I wouldn't care. I mean, who snoops through their best friend's stuff? But something made me pause. A notification had popped up, and even from a distance, I could see Ava's name on the screen. My heart sank. I told myself it could be anything, maybe a joke, something harmless, but the timing felt too coincidental. I tried to push the thought away as I grabbed the firewood and headed back inside. But that little detail, Ava's name on Matt's phone, stayed with me all night. Before I continue, there's something important I need to mention about Ava and Matt. They weren't strangers when we all met. Ava had known Matt through me, but they'd always had a friendly dynamic. I'd even joked once that if I hadn't been around, maybe they'd have ended up together. At the time, it felt like a harmless comment. Now, it felt like a cruel irony. Ava once told me that Matt reminded her of the kind of guys she used to date before we met, charming, carefree, and just a little bit reckless. She said it half-jokingly, but I couldn't help wondering if there was some truth behind it. Maybe I'd always been a little too safe for her. I was the guy who planned things out, who thought long-term, while Matt lived in the moment. By the third day, the tension between Ava and me was palpable, at least on my end. She seemed oblivious, laughing and chatting like everything was fine. Meanwhile, I found myself retreating further into my own thoughts, second-guessing every interaction. Nina must have sensed something was off, because she pulled me aside while the others were outside chopping wood. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "You've been really quiet." I wanted to tell her everything, the unease I felt, the suspicions I was trying to ignore, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I forced a smile and said, "Just tired. Work's been crazy, you know." She nodded, accepting my excuse, but I could tell she didn't entirely believe me. "Well, if you ever need to talk, I'm here," she said, squeezing my arm before heading back to the kitchen. That night, as I lay in bed next to Ava, I couldn't sleep. She was scrolling through her phone, her face lit by the faint glow of the screen. I wanted to ask who she was texting, but I bit my tongue. I told myself I was overreacting, that this trip was just bringing up insecurities I hadn't dealt with. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. And the worst part? I felt like I couldn't trust the two people I was supposed to be closest to in the world. I'll stop here for now. The next part will dive into some of the more subtle clues I started picking up, and the moment that made me realize I couldn't keep ignoring my gut. Thanks again for reading, and for your support. It's helping me keep my head straight through all of this. I'm back. Picking up where I left off, thanks again for sticking with me through all this. Writing it out helps, but it's also unsettling to relive these moments knowing where things eventually led. The next morning, we all decided to hike up to a scenic overlook about a mile from the cabin. It was one of those postcard-perfect spots with a panoramic view of the mountains. Nina and I were taking pictures of the scenery while Matt and Ava were a few feet behind us. At one point, Nina asked Matt to take a picture of us. He obliged, cracking a joke about his photographer's fee, and then handed me my phone back. But as I flipped through the pictures later, something stuck out. In the background of one of the shots, Ava and Matt were standing closer than I'd realized. Too close. Her hand was brushing against his arm, and he was leaning into her, saying something that made her smile. It wasn't blatantly inappropriate, but there was an intimacy to it that made my stomach twist. I didn't say anything, but that image stayed in my mind for the rest of the hike. Later that afternoon, while Ava was showering and Matt was outside chopping wood, I noticed her phone buzzing on the counter. It was flipped upside down, so I couldn't see the screen. I wouldn't have even thought twice about it, except it buzzed again, and again, 3 times in quick succession. My curiosity got the better of me. I didn't pick it up. I wasn't ready to cross that line, but I did glance at it when she walked back in, towel-drying her hair. "Who's blowing up your phone?" I asked casually, trying to keep my tone light. Her response was quick, too quick. "Oh, just work stuff. You know how it is." I nodded, but something about the way she avoided eye contact made me uneasy. Work stuff? On a Saturday afternoon during a cabin getaway? I let it slide, but the doubts in my mind were starting to feel less like paranoia and more like warnings. That evening, we were sitting by the fire pit, enjoying the cool mountain air. Nina and I were chatting about random things, work, favorite travel destinations, how much we missed having reliable Wi-Fi, when she said something that caught me off guard. "You know, it's really sweet how close Matt and Ava are," she said, smiling. "It's nice when friends can get along so well." I must have flinched or reacted, because she immediately followed up. "I mean, they're like siblings, right? Just super comfortable with each other." I forced a laugh and nodded, but the comment hit a nerve. Siblings? Maybe. But siblings don't exchange lingering glances or share inside jokes that leave everyone else in the dark. I felt like screaming at her, "Don't you see it too?" On the 4th night, Ava volunteered to make dinner for everyone. I thought it was a sweet gesture. She rarely cooked anymore, and I even offered to help. But she waved me off, insisting she had it covered. I didn't think much of it until she asked Matt to keep her company in the kitchen. It felt harmless at first. Nina and I were in the living room, watching some cheesy horror movie on Netflix, and I could hear Ava and Matt laughing and talking over the sound of clinking pots and pans. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, I started to feel uneasy. When I finally walked into the kitchen to check on them, they were standing close, their heads bent over something on her phone. They both looked up when I entered, their faces a little too blank, like kids caught sneaking cookies. "We're almost done," Ava said quickly, her voice a little too cheerful. I nodded, my throat tight, and went back to the living room. I could feel Nina glance at me, but I didn't meet her eyes. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying every strange interaction, every suspicious moment. Finally, I got up and went into the kitchen to grab a glass of water. That's when I saw it, Matt's hoodie draped over the back of a chair, Ava's scarf tangled up with it. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a gut punch. Why were her things so intertwined with his? I knew I was spiraling, reading into every little detail, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at those 2 pieces of fabric, before finally retreating back to bed. The next morning, I couldn't hide my tension anymore. I was quiet at breakfast, barely touching my food. Ava noticed but didn't push me, which only made me feel worse. Matt, on the other hand, was his usual carefree self, cracking jokes and planning out the day like nothing was wrong. I started to wonder if I was the problem, if I was projecting my own insecurities onto Ava and Matt's friendship. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, that nagging voice in the back of my mind kept whispering, "Something isn't right." I'll stop here for now. The next part will dive deeper into the things I started uncovering as the trip went on. Thanks for reading, and for all the advice. It's been a lifeline during this mess. 'Tis strange, writing this feels like slowly peeling away a bandage, each layer revealing something I wish I hadn't seen. But you all have been incredibly supportive, and it helps more than I can say. Let's dive back in. The morning after the hoodie and scarf incident, we decided to explore a nearby lake. Matt and Nina took one car, while Ava and I rode together. It was the first time in days that Ava and I had any time alone, and honestly, I thought it would help. But the car ride was strained. She was scrolling through her phone most of the time, occasionally laughing softly at something I couldn't see. I asked her what was so funny, and she quickly said, "Just a meme Nina sent me." She didn't offer to show it, and I didn't push, but my stomach was in knots. At the lake, as we unpacked the car, Ava realized she'd left her gloves back at the cabin. "I'll grab them," Matt volunteered immediately, tossing his keys to me so I could lock up his car. It seemed innocuous at the time. Maybe he was just being helpful. But when I glanced at Ava, she had this odd look on her face, like she was both relieved and nervous. Before I could overthink it, Matt was already driving off, leaving the three of us by the lake. As Nina and I set up the picnic area, I couldn't help but notice she seemed unusually quiet. Normally, she'd be chatting away, teasing Matt, or asking me about work, but today, she was distracted. She'd glance at me, then at Ava, like she was trying to piece something together. Finally, as Ava wandered off to take pictures of the lake, Nina leaned in and said, "Hey, do you think Matt's been acting weird lately?" I froze, unsure of how to respond. "Weird how?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She hesitated, biting her lip. "I don't know. It's probably nothing. He's just been distant, I guess." And I thought maybe he was stressed, but now I'm not so sure. Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. Was I not the only one noticing things? Before I could respond, Ava called out to us, waving her phone and shouting something about a great spot for pictures. Nina smiled faintly and stood up, but her question lingered in my mind for the rest of the day. That evening, we decided to have a game night, with cards and some cheap boxed wine Matt had picked up on the way back from the lake. By the second bottle, we were all feeling buzzed, except for Nina, who had barely touched her glass. She seemed even quieter than before, watching the rest of us like she was studying something. At one point Matt slurred, "You know what I love about you guys? You're like family to me." He grinned, his eyes a little too glassy, and clinked his glass against mine. "You and Ava, you're the dream team." Ava laughed, a little too loudly, and added, "And you and Nina are relationship goals." Her voice was light, but there was a slight edge to it, like she was trying too hard to deflect. Nina smiled tightly but didn't say anything. I felt like I was caught in the middle of some unspoken tension, and it was suffocating. After the wine ran out, Ava suggested a late-night walk to clear our heads. I wasn't really in the mood, but before I could say anything, Matt jumped in. "I'll go with you," he said, standing up and stretching. "Could use some air." The room fell silent for a split second, just long enough for me to notice. Ava glanced at me, then at Nina, before quickly saying, "Sure, let's go." As they left, Nina busied herself tidying up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to follow them, but Nina caught my arm. "Don't," she said softly, not looking at me. "Just don't." Her words rattled me, and I felt a mix of anger and confusion. Why shouldn't I? What was she thinking? What was I thinking? When Ava and Matt finally came back, their cheeks were flushed from the cold, and they were laughing about something I couldn't hear. I tried to act normal, but I must have failed miserably, because Ava shot me a look and said, "What's with you?" I snapped. "What's with me? What's with you?" "You've been acting strange this whole trip, Ava." Her smile faltered, and she crossed her arms defensively. "Strange how? Because I went on a walk with Matt? God, you're being ridiculous." Nina stood up, mumbling something about needing air, and left the room. Matt tried to intervene, his hands raised. "Whoa, man, let's not turn this into a thing." But I was too far gone. "Maybe it is a thing, Matt," I shot back. "You ever think about that?" Ava's face went pale, but before I could say anything else, she stormed off to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Matt gave me a hard look before following her, muttering something under his breath. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while Ava slept on the far edge of the mattress. My mind was racing with questions, suspicions, and doubts. The tension between us was unbearable, but I didn't know how to break it, or if I even wanted to anymore. And Nina's words, just don't, kept echoing in my head. Something wasn't right. I knew it in my gut. But I also knew that whatever I found, I wasn't going to like the answer. I'll stop here for now. The next part will dig into what I started uncovering the following day, things that made my suspicions impossible to ignore. Thanks again for sticking with me. I'll keep you posted. Hey again, everyone. I appreciate you sticking with me through all of this. It's been an emotional roller coaster, and writing it out helps me process everything. Last time, I left off after that tense argument with Ava and the strange comment from Nina. What followed over the next day was a series of small but undeniable signs that something was horribly wrong. The next morning was cold, both literally and emotionally. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the cabin's heating struggled to keep up. But even colder was the atmosphere at the breakfast table. Ava barely looked at me as we ate. Her answers to my questions were clipped, and she kept her focus on her plate or her phone. Matt seemed unfazed by the tension, cracking jokes with Nina, who gave him a few polite laughs but mostly stayed quiet. It was like everyone was pretending nothing had happened the night before. After breakfast, Ava announced she wanted to head into town to pick up some groceries. She offered to go alone, but before I could say I'd join her, Matt volunteered. I'll tag along. 2 sets of hands will make it quicker. Ava hesitated for the briefest moment before nodding. Sure. I watched them leave, my gut churning. Something about the way she avoided my eyes as she walked out the door made me feel like I was suffocating. With just Nina and me left at the cabin, the silence became unbearable. I decided to chop some firewood to burn off my frustration. As I swung the axe, I noticed Nina standing in the doorway, watching me. You okay? I asked, wiping the sweat off my forehead. She stepped outside, hugging her arms to herself against the cold. Can I ask you something? Of course, I said, though I wasn't sure I meant it. Nina hesitated, then said, Do you think Ava and Matt have been weird? The question hit me like a ton of bricks. My first instinct was to deny it, to brush it off like I had been doing for days. But the look on her face stopped me. She wasn't asking casually, she knew something. I don't know, I said carefully. Why do you ask? Nina let out a shaky breath, her eyes darting to the empty driveway where Matt's car had been parked. I don't know. I've had this feeling. Like the way they act around each other sometimes, it's too much. Too familiar. Her words mirrored everything I had been feeling but hadn't been brave enough to say out loud. Yeah, I finally admitted. I've noticed it too. She nodded, looking relieved but also heartbroken. I didn't want to believe it. I mean, Matt can be flirty, but I thought Ava was different. I thought she wouldn't cross that line. The way she said it made my heart sink. What do you mean cross that line? Do you think something's happened between them? Nina bit her lip, hesitating again. I don't know. But I think we both know there's something they're not telling us. When Ava and Matt returned later that afternoon, they acted like everything was fine. Too fine. Matt was his usual loud, carefree self, joking about the town's tiny grocery store, while Ava chimed in with little quips. It was like they were trying too hard to sell the illusion that nothing was wrong. As I helped unload the groceries, a piece of paper fluttered out of one of the bags. I bent down to pick it up, a receipt from a coffee shop in town. I wouldn't have thought twice about it except for the timestamp, 11:45 a.m. They'd been gone for over 3 hours, and the store was only 20 minutes away. What took you guys so long? I asked casually, holding up the receipt. Ava glanced at it and shrugged. We stopped for coffee. Figured we'd take a little break. Together? The question came out sharper than I intended. Matt laughed, clearly unfazed. Relax, man. We didn't elope. We just needed caffeine. Ava shot him a look, then turned back to me. Is that a problem? I shook my head, forcing a smile. No, of course not. But it was. It was a problem. The ease with which they dismissed my question felt like a slap in the face. That evening, as we all sat around the fireplace, Ava asked if anyone had seen her bracelet. It was a silver charm bracelet I'd given her for our anniversary a few years ago, something she wore almost every day. I had it this morning, she said, frowning as she searched through her bag. I must have taken it off at some point. I offered to help her look, but she brushed me off, saying it wasn't a big deal. It'll turn up, she said lightly, but I noticed her exchange a quick glance with Matt. Later, as I was walking past the guest bedroom where Matt and Nina were staying, I saw something shiny on the nightstand through the cracked door. My heart stopped. It was Ava's bracelet. Why was it in Matt's room? I didn't confront Ava about the bracelet that night. I didn't trust myself to stay calm, and I didn't want to blow up in front of Nina, who was already clearly struggling. But I couldn't let it go either. That night, as I lay in bed beside Ava, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The small clues, the lingering glances, the coffee receipt, the bracelet, they all felt like pieces of a puzzle I was too afraid to finish. Something was happening. I didn't know what, but I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning, I resolved to start digging for answers, no matter what I found. I'll stop here for now. The next part will cover what I started uncovering the following day, and trust me, things only got stranger from here. Thanks for sticking with me, I'll keep you posted. The day started off quietly. Too quietly. Ava was up early, which was unusual, sipping coffee alone on the porch. I joined her, hoping to bridge the gap that had formed between us, but the conversation was strained. She kept glancing at her phone, and when I asked who she was texting, she quickly locked the screen and said, "Just work stuff." Matt came out a few minutes later, looking more chipper than someone who'd stayed up late drinking should. He and Ava exchanged a quick glance, a small thing, but it made my chest tighten. Nina emerged shortly after, visibly tired, and muttered something about needing more sleep. I couldn't blame her. None of us seemed fully at ease. After breakfast, everyone went their separate ways. Nina stayed inside reading, Matt went to the shed to tinker with some tools, and Ava said she was going for a walk to clear her head. I decided to clean up around the cabin, hoping the mundane task would calm my thoughts. As I was tidying the living room, I noticed Ava's notebook tucked under one of the couch cushions. It wasn't unusual for her to jot down ideas or thoughts, but after what I'd seen the other night, the frantic scribbles about temptation, I couldn't resist taking another look. I know it was a breach of trust, but at that point, my trust in her was already on life support. Flipping through the pages, I found more entries. Most of them were vague, stuff about feeling trapped and wanting something different. But one line hit me like a punch to the gut. "He makes me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years." I didn't need a name to know who she was talking about. That afternoon, Nina and I ended up alone again while Ava and Matt went to gather firewood. I was chopping vegetables for lunch when she leaned against the counter and said, "Something's not right, you know." I froze, knife hovering over the cutting board. "What do you mean?" She looked at me, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Matt and Ava. I know you've noticed it too. The way they act around each other. The way they disappear." I didn't know how to respond. Admitting it felt like opening Pandora's box, but denying it felt equally wrong. "Yeah," I finally said. "I've noticed." Nina let out a shaky breath, like she'd been holding it in for days. "I keep telling myself I'm imagining things, but I'm not, am I?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and something inside me broke for her. "I don't think you are," I admitted. She nodded, her face crumpling as she tried to hold back tears. I don't understand how he could do this. And with her, of all people." The guilt hit me hard. Nina had been so kind, so trusting, and now she was being dragged through the same nightmare I was. After lunch, Ava and Matt were practically joined at the hip. They played cards together while Nina and I watched, their banter laced with an ease that felt too intimate. I caught myself watching Ava's every move, the way she smiled at Matt, how her hand brushed his when she reached for a card. It was infuriating and gut-wrenching all at once. At one point I stepped outside to get some air. Nina followed me, her face pale. I don't think I can do this anymore, she said quietly. This pretending. I looked at her, my throat tight. What do you want to do? She shook her head. I don't know. But I can't keep sitting there, watching them. We stood in silence for a moment, the tension between us palpable. For the first time, I realized just how much we were both hurting, and how powerless we felt to stop it. That evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, I heard Ava's phone buzz on the counter. She was outside with Matt, so I glanced at the screen, intending to call her in. But the preview of the text stopped me cold. It wasn't from a work contact or Nina, it was from Matt. It was a short message, but it made my blood run cold. Can't stop thinking about earlier. Let's talk later? I quickly stepped away, my heart pounding. The message disappeared as the screen dimmed, but the damage was done. There was no denying it now, something was happening between them. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending I didn't see it. That night I barely slept. Ava climbed into bed like everything was fine, but I couldn't bring myself to lie next to her. Instead, I pretended to be asleep until she rolled over, her back to me. In the darkness, my mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Was it just emotional, or had it crossed into something physical? And most importantly, what was I going to do about it? I'll stop here for now. The next part will dig into the unraveling tension and a couple of incidents that pushed things closer to the breaking point. Thanks for reading, and for being here as I navigate this. It's not easy, but having you all along for the ride helps more than I can say. I've been holding off on this part because, honestly, it still feels unreal. But I promised to keep you updated, so here we go. This was the night everything started to crumble, the night I finally stopped doubting my instincts. It was our last evening at the cabin, and tensions were at an all-time high. Matt suggested we end the trip with a bonfire by the lake, a way to make some memories. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I agreed anyway. Maybe I wanted the distraction. Maybe I wanted to keep an eye on them. We gathered firewood while Ava and Nina prepped snacks. By the time the fire was roaring, the air between us felt thick, almost electric, like something was about to happen. Matt passed around beers, and Ava sat down next to him, closer than necessary, but not close enough to draw attention from Nina. Or so they thought. As the night wore on, Matt got more animated, his voice rising with each story he told. Ava laughed at everything he said, her hand resting on her knee, her fingers twitching as if they wanted to reach for him. I couldn't take it anymore. My grip on my beer tightened, and I stared into the fire, trying to calm the storm inside me. And then it happened. Matt stood up to grab another log for the fire, and Ava followed him. Nina and I stayed seated, making small talk, but my eyes kept drifting toward the edge of the woods where they'd disappeared. They were gone for too long, longer than it took to grab a piece of wood. Finally, Nina looked at me, her face pale. They'd been gone for a while, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my chest tightening. I'm going to check. As I walked toward the woods, I could hear hushed voices. My heart pounded as I crept closer, staying in the shadows of the trees. And that's when I saw them. Matt and Ava were standing close, too close. Her hands were on his chest, and his arms were around her waist. They weren't kissing, but the way they looked at each other made it clear that they might as well have been. I can't stop thinking about you, Matt murmured, his voice low but audible. This trip's been torture. Ava laughed softly, her head dipping in that way she always did when she was nervous but flattered. We shouldn't be doing this, she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Every suspicion, every gut feeling, it was all true. And now I was standing there, watching it unfold like some twisted nightmare. Without thinking, I stepped out of the shadows. What the hell is this? They jumped apart like they'd been struck by lightning. Ava's face turned ghostly pale, and Matt froze, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Dude, it's not what it looks like, Matt stammered, taking a step back. Not what it looks like. I spat, my voice shaking with rage. So you're just out here hugging my wife in the dark for fun? That's what we're doing now. Ava tried to reach for me, her eyes wide with panic. It's not, please, just let me explain. Explain what? I snapped, pulling away from her. That you've been sneaking around with my best friend this entire trip? That you've been lying to my face while I've been trying to fix this marriage? By now, Nina had appeared, drawn by the shouting. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the scene, her eyes darting between Matt, Ava, and me. Oh my God! She whispered. I knew it. Matt turned to her, his face desperate. Nina, it's not. Don't, she said sharply, her voice breaking. Just don't. The rest of the night was a blur of shouting and accusations. Ava tried to explain, claiming it didn't mean anything, and that nothing physical happened, but her words felt hollow. Matt kept trying to deflect, saying he'd been confused, and that it was a mistake. But Nina and I weren't buying it. The betrayal was too deep, the evidence too damning. Eventually, Nina stormed back to the cabin, slamming the door behind her. Matt followed, begging her to listen, while Ava stayed outside with me, her face streaked with tears. I'm sorry, she kept saying, over and over. I didn't mean for this to happen. I stared at her, my heart shattered into pieces. Sorry doesn't cut it, Ava. You didn't accidentally end up in his arms. You chose this. You chose him. She sobbed, reaching for me again, but I stepped back. Don't, I said coldly. I can't even look at you right now. I spent the rest of the night outside by the fire, staring into the flames as they flickered and died. Ava eventually went back to the cabin, but I couldn't bring myself to follow. My mind was racing with questions I didn't have answers to, about our marriage, our future, and how the hell we got to this point. The betrayal was out in the open now, and there was no going back. The next morning, the cabin felt like a tomb. No one spoke at breakfast. Nina sat at one end of the table, her eyes puffy and red. Ava sat across from me, looking down at her coffee, stirring it aimlessly. Matt hovered near the kitchen, his usual cocky demeanor replaced with a nervous silence. Every creak of a chair or clink of a mug felt deafening. I couldn't take it anymore. I pushed my plate away and stood up. We need to talk, I said, looking directly at Ava. Outside. She nodded, her face pale, and followed me onto the porch. The air was cold, biting against my skin, but I barely noticed. My heart felt like it was about to explode. Why? I asked, my voice steady but barely above a whisper. Just tell me why. Ava hesitated, her lips trembling. I don't know, she said finally. It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't mean. Stop, I interrupted, my anger bubbling to the surface. Don't give me that. You don't accidentally have an emotional affair with my best friend. She broke down then, tears streaming down her face. I felt lost. You were always so busy, so focused on work. And Matt. He was there. He listened to me. He made me feel seen. Her words cut deep, but I forced myself to stay calm. So instead of talking to me, your husband, you decided to lean on him? To betray me with him? She shook her head, sobbing. I didn't plan for it to go this far. I swear, it never got physical. Her insistence didn't make me feel better. The emotional betrayal was bad enough. Do you love him? I asked, my voice cracking. She froze, her tears stopping for a moment. No, she whispered. I love you. I wanted to believe her, but how could I? The damage was done. Love isn't just a word, Ava. It's actions. And your actions? They destroyed us. When I went back inside, I found Nina packing her bags. Matt was following her around, pleading with her to stay. Please, Nina, he begged. It was a mistake. I love you. Nina zipped her suitcase with a finality that sent a chill through the room. You don't love me, she said, her voice eerily calm. If you did, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have made a fool of me. Matt looked like he was about to cry, but Nina didn't waver. She grabbed her suitcase, turned to me, and said, "If you're smart, you'll leave too." With that, she walked out the door, leaving Matt standing there, stunned. The ride back to the city was agonizing. Ava and I barely spoke. I kept replaying everything in my head, the moments I missed, the signs I ignored. She tried to reach for my hand once, but I pulled away. "Don't," I said quietly. "Not right now." When we got home, I went straight to the guest room, slamming the door behind me. I needed space to think, to breathe, to figure out what the hell I was going to do. Over the next few days, Ava tried to apologize, to explain, to make things right. She suggested counseling, begged me to give her a chance to prove she was sorry. I wanted to believe her, but every time I looked at her, all I could see was the betrayal. I started seeing a therapist on my own, trying to untangle the mess in my head. It helped, but it also made me realize something painful. I couldn't forgive her. Not completely. The trust was gone, and without trust, there was no foundation to rebuild. One evening, after weeks of sleepless nights and endless arguments, I sat Ava down in the living room. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice steady but heavy with finality. "I love you, but I can't trust you. And without trust, there's no us." She cried, pleaded, begged me to reconsider, but I'd made up my mind. The next day, I contacted a lawyer and started the divorce process. Nina left Matt too. From what I heard, she moved back in with her parents and started fresh. Matt tried to reach out to me a few times, but I ignored his calls. There was nothing left to say. As for Ava, she moved out a month after we filed. I stayed in the house, trying to rebuild my life piece by piece. It wasn't easy, but I started to find myself again, through therapy, through friends, through focusing on things that made me happy. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that trust is everything in a relationship. Without it, even the strongest love will crumble. Ava and I had something beautiful once, but she threw it away. And while I'll always cherish the good memories, I know now that walking away was the right choice. To anyone reading this who's been through something similar, you're stronger than you think. It's not easy, but you can get through it. Life has a way of surprising you, even when you think you've lost everything. Thanks for following along with my story. Writing this has been painful but also cathartic. What do you think about that type of friends? Write your opinion in the comments. If nothing else, I hope it helps someone else feel less alone.